It's April 5, Ukraine Media Center confirmed starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko. Now we will be talking about the influence of weather conditions on fire in ecosystems, in fires and ecosystems of Ukraine. Joining us in our studio are Natalia Ptukha, spokesperson of the Ukrainian Hydrometeorological Center, and Anatolii Shkarbuta, deputy head of the prevention unit of the Fire Safety Office in the Emergencies Prevention Department of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. So, Ms. Natalia, the warm weather has come to all of the regions. So how does the weather influence the risk of fires in ecosystems of Ukraine? Good morning. Pleasure being here. Well, of course, as the warm weather is coming, the risk of fires has grown. We can call it a potentially dangerous weather in terms of hazard it may produce. This period lasts usually from April to October. And what do the meteorologists mean by this indicator that we calculate every day from our meteorological stations in Ukraine? So what does it include, and what can we find out having these calculations on hand? So basically, the main conditions are meteorological conditions, which are the main factor that either favors or prevents the spreading of natural fires in ecosystems. The biggest factors among them are, of course, the air temperature, air humidity, soil humidity, amount of precipitations, and speed of or velocity of wind. The area of fires grows with the growth of the temperature of air and duration of the warm period. The influence of warm air influences more on fires where the humidity is low. The probability of fires grows during dry period with no precipitations. What I can also emphasize that even in case of precipitations, obviously it's reasonable to expect precipitations within the period from April to October, because it doesn't happen otherwise. So if we have precipitations during some period, the risk of fire respectively is being reduced. Also, what influences the condition or the risk of fires is the wind. It does not only dry the soil, dry the air, and has the humidity evaporate from the soil, and in case of fires, the wind can only assist to spreading it. To solve such tasks, to prevent natural fires, different countries use different approaches and different indicators. In Ukraine, our technique is pretty perfect. It's been tested for a number of years, and it includes a number of components, a number of factors. It allows us evaluating the balance of meteorological factors to increase the humidity in soil to the depth of 20 centimeters, where the majority of the roots of the vegetation are. So what does this indicator include? The indicator that you're going to see within the warm period in our website, in our channels. So those are 5 classes, and the most dangerous is class 5. So what does it include? So the climatic conditions in Ukraine, seasonal conditions for fire. What I mean by that, in Ukraine we have 3 regions, like conditionally say, 3 regions of fire risk. It's Polissa, then central and northern Europe, and the majority of southern regions. And within a number of years, we observed that the peak of fires in the first and second region, basically in western and northern and central regions where the forests prevail, the peak falls on the spring period. So basically now, the beginning of the season, now we don't have any snow, there is no enough vegetation, but still there is the last year fallen leaves that may create an additional factor to increase the risk of fires in those regions. But at the same time, in the southern regions, the peak falls on the summer period, What's also taken into account is the condition of soils, because the soils are different all across Ukraine, and depending on the nature of soil in specific territory, respectively, different amount of precipitations is needed to reduce that risk. Also, what's taken into account, as I've mentioned, is the deficit of humidity, uh, the dryness of air, and the dryness of soil. The most threatening is the level 5, as I've mentioned, the extreme level of fire hazard. It's created during the dry weather with no precipitations within 7 or 10 days or more, or the amount of daily precipitations does not exceed 1 millimeter with a temperature of 25 degrees centigrade and above. So during periods like this, such conditions were observed in Ukraine in the southern regions, maybe even for months sometimes. According to the forecast for this year, the April and October 2024, the average monthly temperature is forecasted to be 1 degree above the standard, and the amount of precipitations will be close to the standard in April and May, and in the western and northern regions a little bit above the standard. During this period, the precipitations will be non-balanced around Ukraine, which may result in those prolonged periods of 7 to 10 days that I've mentioned, that may result in increased fire risk, probably within June through August. And what's main thing I need to emphasize, that no matter what the meteorological conditions will be, of course we calculate them, but the fires or ecosystems do not erupt by themselves. The main factor is the open fire, which is usually brought by people. So what I want to highlight, that please take all reasonable care while handling fires. For example, in Volyn region last year there was threat level 5 and in with no fires. Meanwhile, in Dnipropetrovsk region there was a threat class 3 with a lot of fires, which was only result of the fact that people were taking all reasonable care in Volyn region. Meanwhile, in Dnipropetrovsk region, yes, we know the situation is complicated in the front lines. There is a lot of troops stationed there, a lot of internally displaced persons. So basically, the region is saturated with people, which is another factor for increasing the risk of fire. You know, like during weekends, people go out on picnics, but the situation is currently different. This is why we don't take into account this human indicator, human factor. There is a martial law, the picnics, the visits to the forests are basically prohibited, so we don't take into account these factors. And other factors such as descent from Sahara Desert and other factors that sometimes reach Ukraine, how do they influence the risk of fires from the point of view of meteorology? Well, this dust from Sahara has no correlation with fires at all, but anticyclone, as you might have mentioned, results in a prolonged period without rains, without precipitations. That's the field of the low pressure, which may assist to the absence of precipitation. So basically, starting from next Monday, we expect the formation of anticyclone in Ukraine, and next week we will have the weather without precipitations mostly in all regions of Ukraine. We have to keep track of the class of the fire risk. There is no extreme or not even the high risk. It's like within the limits of average, but our experts keep monitoring the situation and publish the indicators in all of our social networks and pages online. Thank you, Ms. Natalia. Mr. Anatolii, we would like to hear from you. How does the State Emergency Service cooperate with the State Meteorological Center? How do their calculations help you to prevent fires in ecosystems? Good afternoon. Really, the joint work with the Hydrometeorological Center helps the State Emergency Service to prevent fires in ecosystems. First of all, using their calculations, their figures, we intensify the monitoring of situation in ecosystems at the account of relevant actions being taken using the quadrocopters and using the monitoring teams that are made of the representatives of law enforcement, environmentalists, ecologists, representatives of state emergency service and forest services. We prevent the excessive visiting of forests, we identify more violators, and thus we prevent the eruption of excessive amounts of fires. Well, Ms. Natalia has mentioned that there is a human factor on top of natural factors. So what is the share, so to say, of nature that influences the fires in ecosystems, and what is the share of the human factor? Well, according to the statistical data, the main reasons of fires during specifically this spring period when the temperature is growing is negligent handling of fire by people, and the majority of cases is the intentional burning of dried vegetation, which results in high-scale fires. Obviously, the nature and the weather conditions influence the scale and amount of fires, because if there is a strong wind, the epicenter of fire is expanding as well as its scale. But again, the main cause of fire in ecosystems is either intentional or negligent handling of fire during burning of dried vegetation. Maybe you can give us some figures. What is the number of fires that were documented since within the latest period? Yeah, within the last 3 months of the year 2024, there were more than 3,700 fires in ecosystems, which is twice as much as an equal period of the previous year. And this indicator is of concern to the representatives of State Emergency Service and other services, because it's an anomaly. We exercise all reasonable activities to prevent this number of fires. Recently, there was a session of the State Commission for Emergency Situations, which contemplated for all of the central and local governments a number of activities to prevent fires in ecosystems, respectively. Using the monitoring activities, we try to identify the violators and hold them accountable. So what do you relate this growth to? Well, again, if we use the statistics, in the majority of cases, it's just the negligence of the people. Unfortunately, the largest category of violators are the elderly people who have their traditions to burn this dry vegetation from their early years. Like the young generation treats these kind of situations in a different manner. This is why we try to do the prevention work with the elderly, mostly in rural areas. So this irresponsibility, it always existed. Like the elderly were always burning the dry grass, dry vegetation, but you're talking about some abnormal growth. Maybe it's related to the explosions, to the battle operations. Well, of course there is the growth in the number of fires that resulted from battle operations in the areas along the front lines. That's true. So the biggest number of fires really erupted in the Dnipropetrovsk regions, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Kyiv, and Ivano-Frankivsk regions. As we see from those statistics, the biggest number of fires is happening in the areas along the front lines. But again, even they break out as a result of negligence of the people and their irresponsible handling of fire. Do we have any questions on the floor? Anastasia Rakuta, Ukrinform. First question is to Ms. Natalia. How abnormal is such a phenomena as dust from Sahara? How is it abnormal for Ukraine? Should we expect this phenomena to repeat shortly? And was there a number of hazardous emissions in the air exceeded as this Sahara dust has reached Ukraine? Well, obviously we monitor the movement of this dust to Ukraine and across Ukraine, and it's coming as a result of the atmospheric front in Sahara, which resulted in a sandstorm there, like a full-fledged sandstorm, which resulted in bringing a lot of sand into the air. It was quite intensive, and the airflows were such that this dust and sand was brought to Europe, to Balkans, and eventually Ukraine. Large dispersed particles had fallen as precipitations in Balkans and Mediterranean region, and the dust reached Ukraine in the upper layers of atmosphere, and it was looking kind of opaque. I mean, the sky, and this dust does not result in any negative influence on health of Ukrainians, maybe to those inclined to have respiratory diseases, and it may also influence the mucous membrane of the eyes. Also, there was an atmospheric front moving through the territory of Kyiv region that was carrying more humidity with it. I mean, precipitations and clouds, and in front of it there were gusts of wind, and within half a year in Kyiv region there was such an agitation, more dust and sand, but it was dust and sand originating from the local areas. There was still a lot of dust from Sahara, but after this front has passed with all that humidity that came to Ukraine from the west, it all washed out that dust from atmosphere, and now the situation is stabilized. Later on the internet, there's a lot of news that this phenomenon may repeat, and it's true. There's yet another portion of dust that has come to France recently, but in Ukraine the airflows are currently different, and until the 10th of April at least we don't expect any new dust incoming. And thank you. Another question to Mr. Anatolii. Can you please tell us whether the burners of the dried vegetation are being held accountable, and what is the liability contemplated by the legislation in force? Well, the State Emergency Service identifies the violators more frequently currently and holds them accountable, bringing them to administrative liability. I would like to urge you, the violators, the State Emergency Service progress and advance in terms of identification of violators. We use the drones, quadrocopters, to identify the perpetrators, so the situation is such: we see you and you don't see us so far. The percentage of bringing to administrative liability is almost 100. If we identify a perpetrator, it's 100% guarantee that we may hold them accountable, bring them to administrative liability. In fact, the enemies for the violators of the fire safety are not the representatives of State Emergency Service or Forestry Services. The enemies of the burners are the burners themselves, because they produce harm on the environment, they inflict harm on themselves, their families, because burning the dry vegetation, they breathe in the residues of the smoke, their families breathe it in, they destroy the flora and fauna, everything that is around the violator. So the enemy of the violator is the enemy, or sorry, is the burner themselves. Another question, Olena Opanenko. Mr. Anatolii, can you please give more details? What is the liability? What is the administrative liability for those who burn the dry grass? And maybe you have some statistics, some figures about the number of people who were affected by fires. Well, due to the changes to the legislation, we've increased the penalties, and now the penalty is from 1,500 up to 6,000 hryvnia, and it's a significant amount given the fact that the main violators of fire safety in ecosystems are the elderly, the retired people. For them, it's a significant financial blow, so to say. This is why State Emergency Service, first of all, does the preventive work, and if the violators result to be like inclined to perpetrate repeatedly, they are being brought to administrative liability. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank our guests. And let me remind you, we were talking about the influence of weather conditions on fire situation in Ukraine. And Ukraine Media Center will continue its operations next week. Thank you for staying tuned.